Woo! Okay. So, Tanshe Kioao, Drew Stewart, Deshination, Kem Kemale, Oshinia, Vancouver, Oshinia. So, hello, how are you? How are all of you? My name is Drew Stewart. I come from Kem Kemale, or what people generally now call Vancouver. So, this is a Squamish word that I recently learned with a few of my colleagues here, and it means grove of maple trees, and it's the name of Squamish Village that's very close to where I am, which is now called Crab Park, and so it's good to be here. I'm calling in from the unceded traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh in Vancouver, and it's an honor to have grown up and raised my family here in the territories of the Three Nations. So yes. I am the manager, climate change policies and programs at MNBC's Ministry of Environment, Climate Change, and Food Security. I'm a proud Métis citizen, and I spend a lot of my time working on policies and programs specific to emergency management. My family names are Mann and Erasmus, and I have two great grandmothers who received script through Canada's Northwest Half-Breed Commission's activities in the Red River settlements in the latter half of the 19th century. So it's great to be here. Next session, please. Or next slide, please. I just wanted to remind you what you've signed up for here. So this is a monthly seasonal readiness on emergency preparedness webinars. So we do this in partnership with BC's Ministry of Emergency Management, Climate Readiness. And today's event we're hosted by Métis Nation BC, and we have guests with us from Fraser Valley Regional District, BC's Ministry of Water, Land, and Resource Stewardship, and the Ministry of Emergency Management and Climate Readiness. So there you go. Next, and we have a bunch of other events that are coming up. May 9th, extreme heat. June, we'll be talking about mental health and climate change. July, talk about water scarcity, which is already coming into the news already, as you probably know. September, earthquakes, and October, cold weather events. So we'll be reaching out to you about those future events. Next slide, please. Welcome, Holly. So just a little agenda here. We're going to start with an elder prayer. You already heard Marlene there. She's our Region 3 Captain of the Hunt, and we are always very blessed to have her here. So thank you for doing that. Then I'm going to do a little housekeeping, do like a tiny quick icebreaker asking where you're from. And then we have the presentations from the aforementioned ministries. It's going to do some questions and answers, and then promote the next seasonal readiness webinar. So Marlene, if you could please bless us with a prayer, that'd be amazing. Thank you.
For sure. Okay. Creator, I acknowledge I am on the official traditional territory of the Squamish and Okanagan Indians. Special thank you to everyone who participates by attending these valuable services. And also thank you to Drew for hosting these meetings. Tonight be with us as we learn how to keep our families, friends, community safe during a flood event. And be with our speakers tonight, Tarina College, Kelly Sims, Andrew Giles, so we can learn of their endeavors with floods, all my relations.
Thank you so much, Marlene. Really appreciate that. All right, so a little housekeeping. Next slide. Oh no, I just wanted to remind you about during times of emergency, there'll be a banner that pops up on Métis Nation British Columbia's website. And if you click on that, it'll take you to different resources, federal, provincial, and also resources at Métis Nation British Columbia. So as you know, the fire season's already started, unfortunately. So yeah, please look there if you're looking for resources or help. Next slide, please. Okay, some housekeeping. Okay, so this session that you're in right now, thank you for showing up. Hi, everyone. It's held in a meeting format. So you'll be visible if your cameras are turned on, and you can be heard if your mics are on. So it's not like a webinar. This is like meeting style, town hall. So we'll be taking questions at the end. However, if through the presentations, you have any questions, you can either just say hey or raise your hand. There's that raise your hand button, or just speak up. Yeah, just go for it. That's fine. So raise your hand, speak out loud whenever you want. We want to keep it as formal and as productive as possible. The thing, just try and be respectful. They're discussing some distressing and traumatic things. We know we're talking about emergency preparedness and emergency management. So at the end there, we're going to share some more info on MNBC mental health supports and emergency preparedness supports. So there you go. So I want to introduce you to who is here today. I'm so excited, so very excited to have Tarina College here. So Tarina College is from the Fraser Valley Regional District, and she is a proud Métis citizen and board director of the British Columbia Association of Emergency Managers, with over 15 years of experience working on public safety within local government. She was heavily involved in the response operations and early recovery planning of the 2016 Horse River wildfire in Fort McMurray and helped with the evacuation of over 88,000 people. While responding, she and her family were also evacuated from those fires and eventually returned to BC, where she is currently the manager of emergency management with the Fraser Valley Regional District. So I'm very, very happy to call Tarina my friend, and I'm so happy that she is here today. So let's turn it over to Tarina now, and I'll introduce Andrew from the River Forecast Center and Flood Safety Section, and Lisa Slager from EMCR a little bit later when they speak. So let's go for it, Tarina.
Thank you for inviting me here, and I'm grateful to be here today. Public safety is definitely my realm, and I have a well-rounded background in film industry. Film industry led me into the world of emergency management, and everything I did in film has some direct relation to public safety. Are you now seeing the Water on Land and Resiliency screen? Awesome. Okay, so I'm going to give you sort of a field trip of my flood life and leave you with a couple bites that I think will be beneficial to you. I will show pictures of active floods that I have been experiencing, including my own. Nothing in here should be extraordinarily triggering, and you'll see images of damages post-flood. Nothing is going to breach anyone's private and personal information. And I'm sorry, the chair that I sit on is really squeaky, so I'll try not to fidget or wiggle, but it does have wheels. It's such a prank to give someone a chair that squeaks and moves. It's really important to know that floods are a natural phenomenon. Water is water. It existed before we did. It'll exist potentially, we hope, long after we do. Water is powerful and it can move buildings. And what you're seeing here on the right is a photo of a building that was moved from where it was placed. The gentleman in the picture is actually sitting among the foundation blocks. It was the floods in 2017 in New Brunswick that I deployed to in support of the Provincial Emergency Management Recovery Organization. The water moving at 9 feet per second, a common speed for flash floods, can move rocks weighing almost 100 pounds. Sometimes we forget about the power that water brings. What you're looking at on the left here was my deployment to Hurricane Harvey flood response in Texas. And you can see that water was the height of rooftops in the floodlands. And the picture on the right was the Atmospheric Rivers event 2021. And this is one of the neighborhoods in FVRD that has a high level of flooding, so much so that there is literally a sign there that says this area is subject to flooding. And that neighborhood is not typically filled with gravel or debris, but we ended up seeing gravel and debris higher than car heights and in a way that swept cars into the debris flow. In that area. I wanted to show a little bit of a picture of what a typical floodplain is and looks like. You want to know what a floodplain is because we talk about floodplains all the time. And if we don't know what a floodplain is and means, how do we understand if we live in one? We need to know the hazards that we live with so that we can be ready to prepare ourselves for those hazards, because despite all programs and support concepts, we are the people that are accountable for our own outcomes in emergencies and how we prepare to be ready to address those emergencies. This is my basement. Know your home. This house has flooded every single year so far, other than 2024. I was sitting at our dinner table thinking that my husband and I had finally understood what was causing the flooding in our 1952 farmhouse last year. And as I said it, we started to hear water in the basement trickling again. We have now figured it out. We have an intriguing farmhouse built in 1952. We learned that the downspout was piped into a pipe that we thought was going to septic, and we are in a septic tank. In the end, that pipe was actually the same pipe where our kitchen sink gray water drains down under the basement floor, out the basement wall, and into this neat snake pipe that was actually gray watered by someone who lived there long before and was piped underneath the garden so that the gray water from the sink would hydrate the garden immediately adjacent to our foundation. What we didn't know is that the full drain pipe of the house was coming down into the same thing, which caused a backflow into the basement, which caused the pipe to burst. And so this was the last flood we hope that we have in this house, now that we know why and where it's coming from. We all live in really unique structures, and as housing availability becomes tighter and tighter, some of us are more willing to adapt to what some people wouldn't consider as a stereotypical home connected to the same modern systems. So it's okay to live in those environments, but if you live in those environments, you also want to know the basics about how to turn off your electrical, because I would never want to be standing in that if I wasn't holding a flashlight in my hand to light that. We keep our appliances up on bricks now. We're going to look at maybe replacing them with cinder blocks to give them just a little bit more height. So it's always interesting to me to think about floods and think about water just as a natural phenomenon, not necessarily as a catastrophic disaster. This picture on the left, I took somewhere when I was on a flood deployment. I wish I could remember where, but every time I look at this picture, I'm reminded that the neighborhood on the right, which is in Columbia Valley, the south end of Cultus Lake, desperately needs a sign like this on the road, because this is the road. And year after year, this area will flood. The houses along this area see basement seepage. If your home is old, you may see seepage pop in through the walls a little bit more than another structure that has more modern waterproofing. And so I've become a fan of what is called Quickcrete or hydraulic cement. There's a number of different brands that you can buy, but I never have an empty bucket in my home. It is always a full or a half full bucket, because when something starts to leak through a crack or funnel outside in a way that's coming back into the envelope of your home, you absolutely need something to address it. And this stuff cures in 3 to 5 minutes, and you mud it up like clay in your hand. You just scoop out the powder and throw a little bit of your flood water into it. Make sure you're wearing a glove, a dish glove or something, and just paste it on a hole. It will almost always help solve the problem temporarily. And we've used it a few times in that basement. The picture that you're seeing here of the floodlands, this is the Hatzic Prairie Everglades. They flooded in the 2021 atmospheric river. They also flooded in the 2006 big rainstorm that occurred. And it's very common for this area to flood. And ironically, most of the people who habit here, these places don't know of the flood risk because they haven't lived there long enough to live through those floods. And so I leave you with the quote on this one: beyond my control. So often people think a flood is beyond my control. For sure, you're not going to stop the water. But the reality is there are things that you can do to take immediate action. If you own your home and you have the bandwidth financially to handle it, you might, if you lived in a house where your yard becomes a lake, you might, in the dry season, look at remediating the drainage around your property. You might look at waterproofing the outside of your property. If you live in a rental and you don't have the same control or the same economic capacity to adjust someone else's property, you may look at more internal pieces like tar painting or waterproof painting the inside of your concrete foundation in a way that ceases or slims the seepage that occurs, and thinking about sump pumps. Hazards can co-occur. I took this picture, went on a deployment, and you see the fire danger rating is listed as extreme, and this area did have an extreme fire danger. How ironic is it to be looking at someone going into the fire hall that has water that's almost up to his hip height with a fire danger rating of extreme? And we live in this environment now where we absolutely know that hazards can co-occur, and we as people need to think about the hazards that we live among. We have such beautiful, rich natural assets in British Columbia. We live in gorgeous environments. Every one of those gorgeous environments has natural hazards, and those natural hazards are part of our environment. During the or shortly after the atmospheric rivers of 2021, I noticed an update. Commonly in emergency management, we'll hear this saying that for every dollar you spend in preparedness or mitigation, it might save you up to $6 in your own disaster recovery. And the United Nations Disaster Risk Recovery Branch posted a video on their website that was very shortly after the Atmo rivers and included footage from the atmospheric river impacts in the Lower Mainland, identifying that for every dollar spent on reducing disaster risk, it can save up to $15 during the recovery phase. And so recovery would be the time frame when you're dealing with the personal impacts, the household impacts, and potentially economic impacts that you've experienced, even health impacts from those emergencies. This is also a really neat picture. You've got 1940, it's not BC, so it's not the 1948 floods, but you've got a marker that is along a waterway, and it uses a very non-digital, non-technological way of identifying the height of floodwater. If we don't find ways to make ourselves really live with that knowledge, what was the flood height here and when, we really lose sight of it, because humans by nature we'll remember certain things that are our things to remember. We're not typically strong at remembering things that other people experience. When I was in search and rescue it was 2007 was one of an anticipated high floodwater events in the Fraser Valley. And I remember being tasked in search and rescue to go do door knocking throughout some of the high water areas. And as I was going through these areas, the telephone poles had a little wooden marker across the top. And when I learned that that was indicating the height of the 1948 Fraser Valley floods, it felt really significant to just stand there. It was very humbling to know the water achieved that height. All of those poles have since been replaced, and those markers are no longer there. And it will, when I can find a way, become a passion project to see some sort of indicators put back to help people remember that those hazards. And I think it is really important to find non-digital and non-technological ways to remembering things that really ought to be remembered. During the 1990 floods, you can see, if you're familiar with the Lower Mainland of BC, you've got what here is now called Castle Fun Park. This whole area flooded in 1990, and rightfully so. It's a prairie that was a lake. And in 2021, when it flooded again, we heard Minister Farnworth stand on national and media television and say, this was an unprecedented event. We could never have anticipated this could happen. And that's not to say that Farnworth wasn't right in what he was aware of, but he was right in that which he had been exposed to. Again, this is a very clear evidentiary piece of how quickly people can forget, and how quickly a society at large can forget that water is water, and water does wet things. And so sometimes there's opportunity that comes from water on the land. We look right now at very hydrophobic soils that don't want to absorb water as readily as they might when they haven't had drought happening for years. I love it when Mother Nature makes memes for us and we don't have to make those memes. And so this sign, working together to reduce flood risk while the water is covering the words flood risk. That's such a cute one, and I wish I had the credit to make it, but it's just an internet find. And sometimes you'll see human behaviors just be very hazardous, but opportunistic during floods. And there's no shortage of pictures of people floating through drive-throughs, ordering something from a dinghy or a fishing boat during floodwaters. And you see this guy on a Sea-Doo. Floods impact every one of us differently. and it's okay to be impacted differently. I deployed to Hurricane Harvey in 2017, and it was really amazing to see how quickly the community pulled together and how clear the instructions from a FEMA landscape were. Floods in this landscape are so common that people know that they have to push their debris out to the curb, and it needs to be sorted into 3 different debris streams. And you need to have your construction material in this one, and you need to have drywall over here, and you need to have furniture and just general demolition over here. And along comes the procedural aspect of the trucks that are designated to pick up those debris flows. It was a really neat experience tearing someone's kitchen out using a sledgehammer and standing in their home that I felt was completely destroyed other than the shell and the structure. And having this lovely elderly lady hug me and thank me so much for taking the sledgehammer to the remainder of her kitchen as I gutted it, because the goal for her was not, how do I make this stuff go away? The goal was, how do I make the shell of my house livable again? And when we're removing the detriment from that property, we're helping the process of restoration happen faster. When I got to her house, untrained volunteer organizations had come through before and taken furniture and contents that maybe could have been salvaged, and her couch was thrown out her window, and her window was actually broken in the process. Sometimes properties are shut really quickly during a flood, and we focus more on security than we do on ventilation. One of the key things that you can do if your property is going to experience a flood, for sure, protect the envelope of your building, but also think diligently about how your building will vent in the time frame before the evacuation order is rescinded and you are allowed to go back to that home. If your property is locked up, you can think about what a bathroom in a hot shower without a vent on will do. And again, habitat revitalization. I moved a piece of furniture and thousands of these tiny little frogs were just all over the place, but apparently they'd been absent from the environment for a couple of years previous. And so I really want to bring those positive moments back when I look at something that is so disruptive. Those moments help me remember the importance of why floods can be of value to our planet. As for what you can do now, there's no shortage of opportunities. I've given you a couple of little bits and pieces through some of those photos. We've lived in a world where people want you to make photocopies of your ID and your important documents, where you receive recommendations to back them up on a USB stick that you may lose or may not have, and then you're vulnerable to all of that. I take pictures or scan everything to myself, and I send it to myself, and I save it in a folder in my own inbox. It's emergency documents, and I have pictures of my ID. I have a copy of my insurance. I really want you to make sure that if you have insurance, that you plug the 24/7 emergency contact phone number into your phone today, not tomorrow, today, and take your policy number and put it in the little notes section of your contact. Read your insurance policy. And so many people, including me, once upon a time, didn't know what the words inside that policy meant. But read it. And through this web link here, I'll make sure that you get that, Drew, so that the team can circulate that. Varani Law is a law agency based out of Ontario, but they focus on disaster insurance law. They experienced a house fire themselves and their family and learned about the gaps as they went through the process, navigating their claim. And so the husband is a lawyer and the wife is an insurance adjuster, and they work cohesively to help make literature available so that people can learn about their insurance. And both the resource center, the blog, and the frequently asked questions have a ton of information to help you understand insurance, whether it's residential or tenants insurance. Additional living expenses may sometimes cover your evacuation coverage, and sometimes it may not. Divert your downspouts 2 meters away from your foundation. Figure out how you can harvest rainwater in this landscape. And while it's raining in the lower mainland today, and I'm ever so grateful for it, it's not lost on me that we are living in a drought, and every drop of rain may be the thing that grows food in your garden. Absolutely figure out where your electrical shutoff is in your home, and then look up your jurisdiction, wherever you live, whatever your city is, look up what their alert system is and sign up for it. The province also offers broadcast intrusive alerting. So if you have the privilege of living where there's cellular service, and you watch cable television and listen to normal radio channels, you may be able to receive those alerts. Where you sign up for your jurisdiction's alert system, your jurisdiction may also have a system that allows you to receive notifications through an app, and may also be able to sign up for text message, email, and landline phone calls. And I know the province is still continuing to modernize how it does alerting. If you use a jurisdictional alert system and a broadcast intrusive alert is issued, you may receive 2 alerts within 2 minutes of one another. That's a really great thing because alerts are made to get your attention and compel you. So we don't want to call those over alerting. We want to call that a double notification to make sure we're getting you to move. So do you know as well that on May 8th, there will be a federal level or a national alert ready test. And if you do sign up for one of your jurisdictional alerting systems, you might get double dinged on that. That's a test successfully twice. And if you only get it once, that gives you an opportunity to know that you have some settings adjustments to make on your local alerting system. There are no settings to adjust for the provincial broadcast intrusive alert notifications. I think that is, oh, it is not my last slide. My last slide is going to be a personal story. During the Fort McMurray fire, my husband, in emergency management, we take a lot of training on mental health, disaster psychosocial support, psychological first aid, and we understand the human emotion, human reaction. Our spouses and family members don't all have the same access to information, but when I stayed in the Regional Emergency Operations Center to do my job and my family had to evacuate without me, my husband didn't have a me toting along with him to deal with all of the triage trauma aspects that he and my children were experiencing. And I had used this app as a recommendation in a number of different realms previous to that event, but it was the first time that I actually had used it in my own family. And I said to my husband, I'm sending you a link and I want you to download this. In the Help Kids Cope app, there is a list of different disaster types. There's floods, there's wildfires, there's, I think, hurricanes, just a whole bunch. And then there's some sections within each hazard that says how to understand the hazard, how to talk to your, or how to understand it yourself, how to help your children. And then it's broken down sort of an age range, how to talk to a toddler about a flood, how to talk to a child about a flood, how to talk to a teenager about a flood. And there's different emotional stages of how to deal with the difficult emotional concepts. So some of those stages would be in advance of a flood, here's how you can teach about the flood based on these age categories. Post-flood, here are some of the traumatic experiences you may notice. Here's how you can dialogue about those. And here is when and how to look for assistance or help through another agency when something is beyond normal. I will continue to recommend this app forevermore because it has been so instrumental in my own family and then more beyond that. It's available both on the Apple App Store as well as the Android Store. And it is designed and developed by the National Childhood Traumatic Something Center in the United States.
Okay, so we're going to move on to the next presenter. Andrew Giles is, it's really, really great that he can be here because there's something special he's going to sort of bring us up to date on. So he's the director of the River Forecast Center and Flood Safety Section, and this is within BC's Ministry of Water, Land, and Resource Stewardship. Andrew's portfolio includes a coordination of flood risk reduction actions and support for communities with river modeling, forecasts, and public advisories. These programs play a key role in understanding flood risk and working with many partners to reduce the impacts of flooding and how to adapt to climate change. So, Andrew, can I hand it over to you? Thank you for being here.
Yes, thanks very much, Drew. And yeah, thanks very much for the invite to come and be part of the conversation tonight. Hi, everybody. I'm a sixth generation settler here with ancestors from England who came to Eastern North America and then to Vancouver Island before I was born, so my parents' generation. And I'm coming today from the traditional territory of the Lekwungen-speaking peoples, the Esquimalt and Songhees nations, where I'm really grateful to raise my family connecting to the land and the water here along the Gorge Waterway. And I've been involved with flood risk reduction with the province since 2017. Um, just, first of all, I wanted to say thanks to Tarina for sharing her experience, and just so valuable to hear some of the firsthand knowledge and the experience and the conversations that you've had with others that have been impacted by floods, and yourself with problem solving in your own home. It's so important to know if you're exposed to flood hazards at that household level, and what you can do to prepare. So thanks for the powerful examples of the impacts of flooding, and also the reminder that floods can both have the negative impacts that we're so familiar with, but also some of the positive impacts as well as we learn to work with water. So I will look at trying to set up my screen here. There we go. Uh, is that showing through now? Great, thanks, Drew. So in the next few minutes, I wanted to share some information on flood management in BC and our collaborative effort to develop a BC flood strategy and some of the other key initiatives toward flood risk reduction. And then I'll also wrap up with a quick look at sort of the seasonal outlook and what our crystal ball is showing for the next few months with flood hazards. So let's get started. So in the last 4 years, we've been working to develop a roadmap for flood risk reduction that looks at a new approach on how we can work with many partners, both inside government and outside of government, to reduce flood risk. And the BC flood strategy has a vision and outcomes and principles for flood resilience. It really responds to the significant disruption and the challenges that across the province we've experienced with flooding in 2017 in the Okanagan, 2018 in Grand Forks, and some of the other communities in the last 5 years, and of course with the 2021 atmospheric river events. And looks at the impacts on the communities, on individuals, on the environment, on critical infrastructure, economic impacts, cultural interests, mental health and well-being. It's pretty wide-ranging, the kinds of impacts. So as I was preparing for the presentation today, I actually had a look at the Métis Nation BC's climate change strategy, and saw a lot of common elements there with the conversations around taking that long-term or that 7-generation view of being able to make decisions now that affect 7 generations into the future, and also looking back 7 generations and understanding and learning from our past. And also looking at that holistic approach on how to improve resilience and how to approach emergency management. What's in the BC flood strategy? The vision is that together we're leaders for innovative, holistic flood risk management, enhancing BC's flood resilience for the 21st century. And it also outlines 8 principles that underpin that. These include being place-based, reflecting regional watershed-based approaches, being proactive as opposed to being reactive to flooding, and ensuring that the approach is fair, that's equitable and accessible to all people at risk. And also that our work is accountable, transparent, and collaborative, and holistic, as I mentioned before. So with the vision and those principles in mind, the BC Flood Strategy outlines 4 pathways and actions that are needed under each. And so the next few slides, I'll go through these 4 pathways and some of these actions just really briefly. The first one is around understanding flood risk. It's tough to be able to manage things if we don't understand them. So trying to get information on what areas could be at risk of flooding, And if flooding does happen, then what are our values that are in the way of those floods? So this would include doing coordinated flood mapping and an understanding through a risk assessment, updating regulatory programs for diking and raising awareness of and education programs and research and training. Next, we need to look at how we're making decisions together and collaborating and sharing decision making across all levels of society. So this would include modernizing our legislation, our policy and guidance, and including what directions we set for things like nature-based infrastructure or land use management guidelines, and promoting an integrated approach to floodplain planning. So we're not so focused on ways of the past or engineering our way out of problems, but what are the suite of other options we can take to be able to reduce flood risk in more of a holistic way? And yeah, I think I've touched on some of these already here. But also there's an acknowledgement here that floods are looking at the downstream end of things, but we also need to be looking at how we're managing the upper areas of the watersheds. And through forest landscape planning, being able to make balanced decisions on how we interact with the land that could affect flood risk. The third pathway is around flood preparedness, response, and recovery. So some of those phases of emergency management that I saw actually reflected in the climate change strategy. And to do that specifically, we want to focus on some of the work of the River Forecast Center, for instance, on flood forecasting and providing the information that can help make decisions around that early warning or the broadcast intrusive alerts that you were talking about. We also want to update our response plans and our response activities, and then look at how we can enhance post-flood recovery, including building back better and just making investments in mitigating for the future, especially with the changing climate in mind. And the last pathway focuses on making investments in flood resilience. So can we avoid creating new risk by decisions that we're making today on the use of the floodplain? And can we get our feet wet? Can we accommodate some flooding or build or retrofit things in a way that are more resilient to floods? And in some areas where we've got significant values that are exposed to flood hazards, that may be the most effective way to continue to try to protect those. And so commonly that's with pumps or with dikes. But are there ways to be doing this that are more aligned with natural systems and setting back dikes, leaving room for wetlands and restoring natural functions? And lastly, shifting values out of the floodplain often makes sense. So if we can avoid the disruption by having that sort of community-led decisions about moving values out of harm's way, that's an opportunity. It's also important to acknowledge just the impact of the colonial history, where the last couple of hundred years have set a pattern of settlement on the lands where reserves are located for First Nations, and how the land has been developed. And so noting that colonial history and the unique aspects of the current colonial system and how we can try to work towards reconciliation and a better way of moving forward together. And lastly, focusing on revising funding approaches and looking at other tools like flood insurance and for any residual risk that we can't address through the above actions. So just wrapping up on the BC flood strategy here, where are we headed? Over the next 5 years, we hope to begin the details, the the who, the how, the what, and the specifics for those actions that I've gone through. So what is that going to look like? We're working on flood hazard maps and developing improved provincial quality floodplain maps to share, and that'll support community level decision making and sharing of information. And working on regional flood governance and advisory circles to work through some of these opportunities together, updating legislation and policy, and towards the sort of implementation plan, which is a BC flood resilience plan. And then noting that it's sort of a continuous cycle that will require updates as we move forward together on these conversations. So that kind of covers the BC flood strategy part of my presentation. In my other role, I'm also director of the River Forecast Center, and so I just wanted to take a few minutes to share what might be of interest to folks around how are we looking right now as we head into the next couple of months across the province. So I'll just quickly go through where we're at. Our snowpack, as you've probably heard in the media, is quite a bit below normal snowpack for this time of year. And usually April 1st is when we sort of see the peak snow accumulation, and we get a pretty good idea of what our snowpack might look like for flood hazards as we're heading into May and June, which are typically when all that snow is melting off. And that's when we're seeing what's called the freshet, or the seasonal snow melt driven flood hazard. So across BC right now, we're about 63% of average, and almost every area except for the far northwest of the province is below 80% of normal. So overall, it's the lowest average April snowpack that we've seen since the 1970s. So looking ahead, what are we hearing from the weather folks? Environment and Climate Change Canada can look out at what the models are showing, and we're seeing the transition from an El Nino pattern, which is when there's warm water welling up near the equator in South America. That changes around the weather patterns for a lot of North America. And so that's fading out and transitioning to what they call the La Nina pattern, which is a little bit more colder water there, which changes where the jet stream and where all those patterns are. What you need to know about that is that there's a higher likelihood of warmer than normal spring and summer temperatures coming. They also have a look at what that might look like for precipitation, but they haven't really got that a lot of accuracy with that. So there's less confidence in the precipitation long range forecast. But overall, it's looking like we're probably going to be warmer than normal years temperatures for April, May, and June. So what does that mean for flood hazards? Our snowpack being low, but with that warmer temperature, there's less likelihood of major river systems seeing a lot of snowmelt driven flooding this year. So the Fraser, the Thompson, some of the larger rivers. There is still a possibility as we're in the spring season here. There's, as we're seeing with the weather today, it's rainy and cool. So we could have some rain-driven systems in the next few months that could still have some more localized flooding in some basins, but generally not as vulnerable as we would be if we had a much deeper snowpack. Yeah, so with that, just wanted to share all that information and open up for conversation. So thank you very much for inviting me to be part of the conversation today.
Thank you, Andrew. That was great. I really appreciate that. There's a ton of information there. Really appreciate it. Okay, we're going to move on to Lisa Slager. So Lisa Slager is Senior Policy Analyst at the Ministry of Emergency Management and Climate Readiness Disaster Risk Management Division. So Lisa supports collaboration and relationship building with various partners, including MNBC, as we seek to collectively reduce our disaster and climate risks across British Columbia. She also works on various initiatives to better understanding of how these risks are shaped by climate change, including the development of provincial and regional risk assessments that look at a wide range of hazards, including flooding, as well as areas of resilience that are worth emphasizing.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. As Drew mentioned, my name is Lisa Slaker. I am also a settler here, calling from the Lekwungen territories of the Songhees and Esquimalt Nations. So my family comes from a little bit of a blend of Irish and Dutch ancestry. And I feel like in honor of the theme of like learning and language, I was at the vet a couple weeks ago, and there was a gentleman from uh, Europe who had mentioned that my last name actually means butcher, which I thought was like a very fascinating thing I didn't know about my family heritage until really recently. So yeah, we're all just like learning as we go. But yeah, as Drew mentioned, our team works to support risk reduction and mitigation work. So recognizing that floods inevitably happen. So what can we do to reduce the negative impacts on us and our communities when they do? And yeah, without taking up too much time, I'm happy to share some of the projects that the province is working on to manage flood risk, but also sharing some preparedness and resources that might be useful to communities. Let me just pull up my presentation here. All right, can everyone see that okay? All right, fantastic. So yeah, admittedly, not the prettiest first slide to open with. I don't want to go over this in excruciating detail, but really just wanting to emphasize a lot of what has come before as we work on what we're doing now at the province. So again, recognizing Indigenous peoples have been managing and responding to disasters for a lot longer than us at government, and there's a lot of lessons to be learned there that can't fit into this like little graphic. So instead, we've focused on a lot of the key events or work that has come before, but is really important to informing how we go about doing this work in a new way at government, especially compared to the way we've approached this traditionally. So some examples I'll just point out that have been mentioned before, but Drew mentioned the United Nations Sendai framework. So that's a big initiative that has informed the work we're doing now. And you can see common themes of the Sendai framework in the BC flood strategy that Andrew was speaking about. Also, standing on the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And although not reflected here, there's also now the new Métis Nation climate change strategy that I've been speaking about a lot today. And there's a lot of alignment and agreement on our approaches to this work that can be found in the Métis Nation strategy. So also helping to inform the work that we're doing moving forward. And really a lot of this has just told us that we can't look at disasters sort of in this isolated emergency management space anymore. So if we look at things like flooding, it's not just a flooding event that happens and then ends. It's really tied into climate change and influenced over time with the changing nature of the world that we live in. And so how do we work with that? And then how do we do that together more meaningfully with one another? So as I mentioned, the province is really committing to a lot of work in this space. And again, I didn't want to really bore folks with the specifics of each of our projects, but really just wanted to say that our ministry is doing a lot of work in three kind of main areas right now. So the first is looking at bettering our understanding of the risks that we face now and then into the future. So as Andrew mentioned, when talking about the flood strategy is really building that understanding of flooding in BC. And so we're doing some work with risk assessments to kind of figure that out. And then the second is really knowing that now that flooding happens, what do we do to manage flooding, both in preparing for it, but then during and after events as well. And then lastly, we're doing a lot of long-term, high-level strategic planning, but really kind of thinking as we look into the future, what do we want that future to look like and how do we reduce risks and really emphasize and enhance resilience? And so I can share the slide if anyone's curious about anything on the previous one, but I actually wanted to put this up instead while I talk through some of this work that we're doing because I found this like much prettier to look at. So these graphics were actually done by an artist named Erica from Drawing Change, who attended a couple of workshops that we did at the Indigenous Climate Resilience Forum back in February. And she really helped capture some of the dialogue that we were having with Indigenous folks over those few sessions. And so this first graphic here, I thought really spoke to a lot of that work we were doing in the first two areas of understanding risk, but then also managing risks and hazards. So one of the projects we're working on is called the Disaster and Climate Risk and Resilience Assessment. It's a little bit of a long title. I think we're aware of that. But essentially, what we're trying to do is we're looking at the most common hazards across British Columbia, like flooding, to know what our current risk is, how it is shaped by climate change currently and also into the future, and then what are the potential impacts on the things that we care about. So we're broadening that up to not only just look at things that have historically been looked at, like buildings and infrastructure and the economy, but also things like health and well-being and culture and the things that like the social fabric that makes us in that community and the land and the animals that are a part of that ecosystem and community that we're all living in. And so broadening out the way we really understand risks that we're facing. And as Andrew mentioned, even though we're looking at this at a provincial scale, we really want to look at it at a regional scale as well, knowing that flooding happens across the province, but that looks very different depending on if you're like Northeast British Columbia or like Southwest British Columbia. And so you can see some of like the common themes that came out of that dialogue. And so on the left, there's like a beautiful flower wheel of like the things we care about and the different flowers, and a lot of talk about strengths-based approaches and resilience and building in that ecosystem and learning from past events. And so in addition to that, we have also been looking at updating how we manage risks. So updating things like our emergency planning. So not only is it understanding risk, but like when events happen, like flooding, what are we really doing about it? How are we preparing for it? How are we responding to it? And how can we build that out a little bit better so our like bounce back is a little bit quicker? This is another graphic from the same event, but this one was really focused on resilience. So it was really trying to capture some of the strengths and the positives that Tarina and Andrew have been talking about, and really highlighting the visions that people had for themselves now, but also into the future. And so a lot of what was shared was the importance of starting with the land. So you can see that a little bit on the left, the land and food security and centering people and traditional knowledges within this work, and also common themes again about learning from the past. So we've heard about build back better, and some people have been calling it building back with wisdom. But essentially these conversations continue to inform our approach of more of those like long-term strategic plans that we want to develop so that we can reduce risk into the future. And so we're working on a risk reduction plan, and we're also working with the Ministry of Agriculture on an emergency preparedness strategy for food security. Again, food security was a very common theme that's coming up, recognizing that investments into food security before, during, and after events is pretty essential. And again, also aligning a lot of this work with the flood strategy that Andrew spoke to. And so before we close, Tarina mentioned Prepared BC. It is essentially our ministry is responsible for this program. It's an educational program that provides information and resources on how to prepare for emergencies. And so the website has a ton of resources and guides and information to download. There's also social media. We're on all of them. So Instagram, Facebook, X, which used to be Twitter, has updated information as well. But when it comes to flooding, essentially there's a lot of resources that are very specific to flooding as well. So again, flooding can happen anytime. It could be on that local scale or the individual household level, and it can be also on a much larger community or regional level, but really impacts us a little bit differently. So if you find that you're in an area that's prone to flooding, you might find some value in the Prepared BC resources, so they can kind of give information and tips about before, during, and after a flood. And Tarina had mentioned, there is talk of like grab and go bags, and that is in our messaging. And there's also opportunities to be like a little bit flexible of like making those bags potentially like work for you. I think we did a earthquake series with Métis Nation BC I believe it was last October, and there was like people were talking about bringing like chocolate and things that like make you feel like whole and can support your mental health and stuff during events. And so really figuring out what it is that is essential for keeping you safe, but also keeping you well during an event, and how potentially you can make those pre-planning decisions to prepare you for an emergency. And so that's a component of the Prepared BC, but there's also lots of other information and tools there as well. There's also really fun like fill in the blank guides for people who are living in condos or people who want to build like a community like neighborhood plan and really build out that aspect there. And yeah, so lots of resources. And then there's also some mental health resources as well that are available there. So, reminders to, I probably feel like a part of preparedness and coming up early is taking care of yourself before events hit, and building out those like community plans and knowing to check on neighbors and family and friends and elders, and having resources on hand. So I know we talked about putting like your insurance phone number in there, but also like any mental health supports. And I know Métis Nation BC has their own as well for citizens that you can access before and during and after emergencies if you need to, and building out those connections to connect with one another. And I think that's it. Pretty fast and quick, but yeah, really hoping to hear from other people as well and answer any questions. I can put these emails in the as well, but yeah, if you want to get in touch with us, our broader email is the Climate Ready BC, but then we also have the Prepared who can answer anything about preparedness.
And just a reminder that there are resources here. I mean, some of the stuff is tricky and difficult. As Amanda put in the chat, there are mental health resources at MNBC, so please reach out and use those resources on the MNBC website. And I think that's it. Was there one more? And there you go. Those are the rest of our webinars. We really appreciate Andrew. Thank you. Lisa, thank you. Tarina, thank you. And we'll hopefully all see you on May 9th for Extreme Heat with Fraser Health Authority and BC Housing. Thanks, everybody.